On August 5, 1944, in the Wola district of Warsaw, Poland, SS soldiers burst into an apartment building and ordered all residents into the courtyard. Mothers carried babies. Elderly people were helped by their children. Families stood together, confused and terrified. Then, without warning, machine guns opened fire. Bodies fell in waves. Children screamed. Blood pooled on the cobblestones. Within minutes, over 200 people were dead. The SS soldiers then poured gasoline on the bodies and set them on fire. This was just the beginning. For the next 8 days, SS death squads and police battalions moved systematically through Wola, executing every Polish civilian they encountered. Entire apartment buildings were cleared floor by floor, with residents machine-gunned in courtyards or burned alive in basements. At one hospital, SS troops bayoneted patients in their beds, killing doctors and nurses who tried to stop them. In another building, 2,000 people were locked inside and burned to death. By August 12, between 40,000 and 50,000 civilians were dead, making Wola one of the fastest mass killings in history. If this makes your blood run cold, if you can't imagine how humans could commit such evil, then like this video, subscribe to our channel, and leave a comment. Share this so the victims are never forgotten. Because what happened in Wola wasn't random violence, it was systematic extermination ordered by Hitler himself. Now let me take you back to August 1944 to understand how an entire neighborhood became a graveyard in just 8 days. To understand the Wola Massacre, we must first understand the Warsaw Uprising and why the Germans responded with such extreme brutality. By summer 1944, Nazi Germany was losing the war on all fronts. In the West, Allied forces had landed in Normandy and were pushing through France. In the East, the Soviet Red Army had launched a massive offensive that was driving German forces back through Eastern Europe. By late July, Soviet troops were approaching Warsaw, the capital of occupied Poland. The Polish resistance, known as the Home Army or Armia Krajowa, had been preparing for this moment for years. They planned to launch an uprising against the German occupation just as the Soviets arrived, hoping to liberate Warsaw and establish Polish sovereignty before the Soviets could impose their own control. The Home Army, led by General Tadeusz Komorowski, numbered approximately 40,000 fighters in Warsaw, though most were poorly armed, with only handguns, homemade weapons, and limited ammunition. On August 1, 1944, at 5 p.m., the Warsaw Uprising began. Polish resistance fighters attacked German positions throughout the city, seizing control of several districts, including Wola, a working-class neighborhood in western Warsaw with a population of approximately 100,000 people. The initial attacks caught the Germans by surprise, and within the first few days, the Poles controlled about 2/3 of the city. But the German response was swift and brutal. Adolf Hitler was enraged by the uprising. He saw it as betrayal and rebellion that had to be crushed with maximum force. On August 1, he issued orders to Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, to destroy Warsaw completely and kill its entire population. Hitler reportedly shouted, "The city must completely disappear from the surface of the earth and serve only as a transport station for the Wehrmacht. No stone can remain standing. Every building must be razed to its foundation." Himmler immediately dispatched SS and police units to Warsaw with orders to suppress the uprising using any means necessary. The order given to SS commanders was simple and terrifying: kill anything that moves. There would be no distinction between combatants and civilians, no mercy, no prisoners. The entire population was to be exterminated.
Among the units sent to Warsaw was the infamous SS Sturmbrigade Dirlewanger, commanded by Oskar Dirlewanger, one of the most sadistic and criminal figures in the SS. The Dirlewanger Brigade was unique in that it was composed entirely of convicted criminals, including murderers, rapists, and violent offenders who had been released from prisons and concentration camps to serve as shock troops. Dirlewanger himself was a convicted child molester who had been granted a pardon to form this unit. The brigade had earned a reputation for extreme brutality in anti-partisan operations in Belarus and the Soviet Union, where they had massacred entire villages and committed unspeakable atrocities. Alongside the Dirlewanger Brigade came other SS and police units, including the SS Sonderregiment Kaminsky, composed of Russian collaborators, and various Ordnungspolizei, or order police battalions. These forces, numbering several thousand men, were under the overall command of SS Obergruppenführer Erich von dem Bach-Selewski, an experienced SS commander who had led anti-partisan operations on the Eastern Front. On August 4, German forces began their counteroffensive in Wola. The initial attacks targeted Polish resistance positions, but it quickly became clear that the Germans were not just fighting insurgents, they were waging war against the entire civilian population. German tanks advanced down Wolska Street, one of the main thoroughfares in Wola, using Polish civilians as human shields. Approximately 300 Polish men and women were forced to walk ahead of the tanks, with German soldiers threatening to shoot anyone who tried to escape. As the tanks approached Polish barricades, the insurgents faced an impossible choice: shoot and kill their own people, or allow the Germans to advance. Many Poles were killed in the crossfire. Those who survived were released only after the Germans had broken through the defenses. By the evening of August 4, German forces had secured control of the southern part of Wola. The stage was now set for what would become one of the most horrific massacres of World War II. On the morning of August 5, 1944, the systematic extermination of Wola's civilian population began. SS units led by the Dirlewanger Brigade began moving through the district block by block, building by building, executing every Polish civilian they encountered. The killing was not random or chaotic, it was organized and methodical. SS officers divided their forces into killing squads, each assigned to clear specific buildings and execute the residents. The pattern was always the same. Soldiers would enter a building, order all residents out, separate men from women and children, and then execute them in groups.
The massacres in Wola on August 5, 1944 were carried out with industrial efficiency and sadistic cruelty. SS death squads moved systematically through residential buildings, executing thousands of civilians in just the first few hours. One of the first major massacre sites was the complex known as the Hankevich houses at 105 to 109 Wolska Street. This was a large residential complex housing approximately 2,000 people, including many families with small children. On the morning of August 5, units from the Dirlewanger Brigade surrounded the buildings and ordered all residents to gather in the courtyards. The terrified residents complied, believing they were being evacuated. Instead, they were lined up against walls and machine gunned. Entire families died together, mothers holding babies, fathers trying to shield their children, elderly grandparents clutching each other. The shooting continued for hours. Those who survived the initial volleys and tried to crawl away were shot again at close range or bayoneted. By midday, over 2,000 people were dead, their bodies piled in the courtyards. A similar massacre occurred at the Wawelberg houses at 15 Górczewska Street, where between 2,000 and 3,000 residents were executed in the same manner. SS soldiers herded residents into courtyards and basements, then opened fire with machine guns. When the ammunition ran out, they threw grenades into the groups of people and set buildings on fire. Those who tried to escape the flames were shot. The screams could be heard throughout the neighborhood. Hospitals became sites of particular horror. The Germans showed no respect for medical facilities or the sick and wounded. At the Wola Hospital, SS troops burst into the wards and began executing patients in their beds. Doctors and nurses who tried to protect their patients were shot on the spot. Some patients were too sick to move and were bayoneted where they lay. Others were dragged from their beds and executed in hospital corridors. One witness later testified, SS soldiers went from room to room shooting everyone: the wounded, the dying,
The doctors trying to help them, no one was spared. Blood covered the floors. The hospital became a slaughterhouse. At another medical facility, the Karol and Maria Hospital on Wolska Street, SS troops executed approximately 400 people, including patients, medical staff, and civilians who had sought refuge there. The hospital director, Dr. Zbigniew Umostowski, tried to negotiate with the SS officers, showing them Red Cross symbols and explaining that the building was a protected medical facility.
The Germans ignored his pleas and forced everyone to gather in the courtyard, where gunfire soon echoed through the air. Across the city, countless civilians faced unimaginable cruelty. The Dirlewanger Brigade, infamous for its brutality, carried out widespread abuse and terror against the people. Women, girls, and the elderly suffered deeply, as fear and humiliation were used as weapons to break the spirit of Warsaw. On August 5, one of the most horrifying incidents took place at a church on Wolska Street. Hundreds of civilians, including mothers with children, had taken refuge there, believing it would be a safe sanctuary. But German forces stormed in, separated families, and began their deadly work. Men were executed beside the church walls, while women and children were trapped inside as the building was set ablaze. Those who tried to flee were met with gunfire. Witnesses recalled the cries and prayers fading beneath the roar of flames. Around 500 innocent lives were lost in that single place. The violence spread throughout Wola. Soldiers went house to house, shooting anyone they found, from the elderly in their beds to families hiding in basements. Entire homes were burned with people still inside. Those who tried to escape were cut down in the streets. Survivors spoke of entire families lost, of neighbors disappearing, of silence where life once was. By the evening of August 5, 1944, over 15,000 civilians had been killed in Wola alone. The streets were filled with the aftermath, ruin, smoke, and unbearable loss. Yet the horror did not end there. The next day, August 6th, the killing intensified. Death squads moved through new districts, destroying everything in their path. At one factory, thousands of Polish workers and their families were executed and buried in mass graves. In another shelter, where hundreds hid underground, soldiers sealed the exits after throwing explosives inside. No one survived. The Wola Massacre would stand as one of the darkest days in human history, a moment when cruelty consumed an entire city.
By August 7, 1944, the massacre in Wola had reached its peak of brutality. SS units under Oskar Dirlewanger's command had perfected their killing operations, moving through the district with systematic efficiency. The commanders had divided Wola into sectors, assigning each killing squad a specific area to cleanse. The goal was clear. No Polish civilian was to be left alive. One of the most notorious massacre sites was the Gęsiówka concentration camp facility, located in Wola. This was a small forced labor camp where Jewish prisoners had been held. On August 5-6, as the SS moved through Wola, they entered the camp and executed all remaining prisoners, approximately 350 Jewish men and women who had survived the Holocaust only to be killed at the very end. Some were shot, others were beaten to death, and some were burned alive in barracks. The Dirlewanger Brigade earned a particularly horrific reputation during the Wola Massacre. These convicted criminals, released from prisons to serve in the SS, committed atrocities that shocked even hardened Wehrmacht officers. They raped women in front of their families, tortured victims before killing them, and engaged in sadistic games. In one documented incident, Dirlewanger soldiers forced a group of Polish men to run while they shot at them for sport. Those who fell were finished off with bayonets. Children were not spared from the cruelty. SS soldiers murdered children in front of their parents, using methods that were deliberately cruel. Babies were torn from their mothers' arms and smashed against walls or thrown from windows. Young children were bayoneted or shot at point-blank range. In some cases, children were forced to watch their parents being executed before they themselves were killed. The psychological torture was as brutal as the physical violence. Throughout the massacre, the Polish resistance in other parts of Wola continued fighting desperately against overwhelming odds. They could hear the screams of civilians being executed, see the smoke from burning buildings, and witness the bodies piling up in the streets. But they were powerless to stop the massacre.
The SS had superior numbers, weapons, and armor. Polish fighters could only watch in horror as their families and neighbors were slaughtered. On August 8th, Heinrich Himmler received reports from Warsaw detailing the progress of the massacre. SS Obergruppenführer Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski, the overall commander of the operation, informed Himmler that tens of thousands of Polish civilians had been executed and that Wola was nearly cleansed. However, Bach-Zelewski also expressed concern about the behavior of some units, particularly the Dirlewanger Brigade, whose atrocities were so extreme that they were demoralizing even German soldiers and creating discipline problems. That evening, on August 8th, Himmler issued a modified order. The mass killing of women and children was to stop. Men of military age could still be executed as suspected insurgents, but women and children were to be sent to concentration camps instead. This order was the result of practical considerations, not humanitarian concerns. German officials realized that the complete extermination of Warsaw's population would create a labor shortage and complicate the occupation of Poland. Additionally, some Wehrmacht officers had complained that the indiscriminate killing was unnecessary and counterproductive. However, the order came too late for tens of thousands of victims. By August 8th, the majority of Wola's civilian population was already dead. And even after the order, killings continued in many areas, as SS units ignored or claimed not to have received the directive. On August 9 through 12, the nature of the atrocities shifted slightly. While mass executions of women and children became less common, SS units continued killing men and teenage boys on the grounds that they were suspected insurgents. Women and children were now being rounded up and marched out of Wola toward collection points, from where they would be deported to concentration camps. But even during these deportations, violence continued. SS soldiers shot stragglers, the elderly who couldn't keep up, and anyone who tried to help them. The forced marches out of Wola became death marches, with bodies lining the routes. By August 12, 1944, the Wola district was virtually empty. The once vibrant neighborhood of 100,000 residents was now a graveyard. Conservative estimates placed the death toll at between 40,000 and 50,000 civilians killed in just 8 days. Some historians believe the true number may be even higher, possibly exceeding 60,000. The bodies of victims were everywhere. Thousands lay in courtyards where they had been executed. More were inside burned buildings, charred beyond recognition. Many had been thrown into basements and covered with rubble. The SS made some attempt to hide the evidence by burning bodies or burying them in mass graves, but the scale of the killing was so vast that they couldn't conceal it all. The few survivors who emerged from hiding places or who had managed to escape described scenes of absolute horror. The entire district smelled of death. Rats fed on corpses in the streets. Buildings stood as burned-out shells. The silence was eerie. A neighborhood that had once been full of life, laughter, and families was now utterly dead.
After the Wola Massacre ended on August 12, 1944, the Warsaw Uprising continued for nearly 2 more months in other parts of the city. The Polish resistance fought heroically, but without outside support they were doomed. The Soviet Red Army, which had reached the outskirts of Warsaw,
stopped its advance and waited on the eastern bank of the Vistula River while the Germans crushed the uprising. Stalin saw the Warsaw Uprising as a threat to Soviet control of post-war Poland and deliberately allowed the Germans to destroy the Polish resistance. On October 2, 1944, after 63 days of fighting, the Polish Home Army surrendered. The Germans then proceeded to systematically destroy the entire city of Warsaw. Buildings were blown up block by block. By January 1945, when Soviet forces finally entered Warsaw, over 85% of the city was destroyed, and approximately 200,000 civilians had been killed during the uprising and its aftermath. After Germany's defeat in May 1945, efforts began to document the atrocities committed in Warsaw and to bring the perpetrators to justice. Survivors of the Wola Massacre provided detailed testimony about what they had witnessed. Mass graves were excavated, revealing thousands of bodies. Forensic evidence confirmed the systematic nature of the killings. Several key perpetrators were put on trial after the war. SS Obergruppenführer Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski, who had commanded the German forces during the Warsaw Uprising, was captured by American forces. Surprisingly, he was never prosecuted for the Wola Massacre. Instead, he testified as a prosecution witness at the Nuremberg trials against other Nazi leaders. In exchange for his testimony, he received lenient treatment. He was eventually tried in German courts in the 1960s for murders unrelated to Warsaw and spent the rest of his life in prison, dying in 1972. Oskar Dirlewanger, the commander of the brigade that carried out many of the worst atrocities in Wola, was captured by French forces in June 1945. He died in French custody shortly after, reportedly beaten to death by Polish guards who recognized him. His death meant he never faced trial for his crimes. Many members of the Dirlewanger Brigade were killed during the war or executed after capture. Others escaped and were never found. Some members of the SS units involved in the massacre were tried by Polish and Soviet courts. Several were convicted and executed for war crimes.
However, many perpetrators escaped justice. Some fled to South America or other countries and lived out their lives under assumed names. Others returned to Germany and blended back into civilian society, their crimes forgotten or unpunished. The memory of the Wola Massacre remained alive in Poland, even during the communist era. Survivors formed organizations to preserve testimony and ensure that the world would not forget. Memorials were erected at massacre sites throughout the former Wola district. Schools taught about the uprising and the massacre as central events in Polish history. Every year on August 1st, the anniversary of the Warsaw Uprising, sirens sound throughout Warsaw and the entire city stops for a moment of silence. In recent decades, historians have conducted extensive research into the Wola Massacre, using German military records, survivor testimonies, and forensic evidence. Their work has confirmed that the massacre was not a chaotic outbreak of violence, but a deliberate, organized campaign of extermination, ordered from the highest levels of Nazi leadership. The Wola Massacre stands as one of the fastest mass killings in history. To kill 40,000 to 50,000 people in just 8 days required organization, resources, and a complete abandonment of humanity. It demonstrated that genocide is not just about concentration camps and gas chambers. It can also be carried out with guns, grenades, and fire by ordinary soldiers following orders. The massacre also raises profound questions about human nature and moral responsibility. The men who carried out the Wola Massacre were not all fanatical Nazis. Many were ordinary police officers, soldiers, and even criminals who had been released from prison. Yet they participated in mass murder without significant resistance. This pattern of ordinary people committing extraordinary evil when ordered to do so has been observed in genocides throughout history. Today, the site of the Wola Massacre is a residential and commercial district of Warsaw. The city has been rebuilt, and few physical traces of the massacre remain. But memorials, plaques, and museums throughout Warsaw ensure that the memory of Wola is preserved. The Warsaw Uprising Museum, opened in 2004, includes extensive exhibits on the Wola Massacre, featuring survivor testimonies, photographs, and artifacts. The lesson of Wola is clear. When authority demands obedience without morality, when propaganda dehumanizes the enemy, and when violence is normalized, ordinary people can become murderers. The massacre reminds us that civilization is fragile, that evil can spread quickly, and that silence in the face of injustice is complicity. The victims of Wola, the mothers, fathers, children, and elderly who were murdered simply because they were Polish, deserve to be remembered. Their suffering must not be forgotten, because in their memory lies a warning for all of humanity. We must never allow such atrocities to happen again.